So Ryan Day's not going to make a big deal out of the Oregon game. But he doesn't have to make a big deal out of the Oregon game because if you look up there, that's already making a big deal out of the Oregon game. I'm Stephen Means. That's Andrew Gillis, and that's Stefan Krajisnik. Here's a baseline question, and we can go anywhere we want with this conversation. Is the Ohio State-Oregon game, number 2 versus number 3, in Eugene, 7:30 on NBC, is that the most important game left on Ohio State's schedule?
I think so, in terms of 2024 implications. Now, if we want to talk about Ryan Day's tenure and the importance of beating Michigan this year, yes, that's obviously the most important. But I think right now when we look at that game, that might be an unranked team when they arrive in Columbus. So I think this game, in terms of establishing where Ohio State ranks nationally, how serious of a national title contender they are, and how serious of a Big Ten contender they are, this is our first real test, right? Like, this game will determine, when we wake up on October 13th, who is maybe the best team in the country, let alone who's the best team in the Big Ten. This is the game that everyone's had circled for a while. This is the game that we knew for a while. Yeah, game day is probably going to end up going to Eugene, right? Like, this is when it was July and people were talking about fall weddings. October 12th was the date that was talked about because people knew this game was on that schedule. So I think for months this has been setting up as the biggest game on Ohio State's schedule. And I think when November arrives and when the playoff starts to begin, we're still going to look at this game and say, yeah, that was a massive game because that showed us whether or not Ohio State was, worthy of the expectations that we had for this team coming into the season. Because if you remember, people like Urban Meyer were setting some pretty historic expectations for this team. This is the first real test. This is the first real sign. And this is probably the best opponent on their schedule.
That's interesting last way to end that. Do you agree with both of those statements, Andrew? This is the most important game on Ohio State's schedule going forward, and also it's the best team on Ohio State's schedule.
This is the best team on Ohio State's schedule. I don't think it's the most important game, and here's why. I still think it's Michigan, and I think there are a lot of different ways that you could take this, as you said. I think, you could look at the Oregon matchup and say, wow, like this is a top 5 matchup. You could say Penn State, and I don't think that's crazy because that's coming down the line as well. That's another road game that's going to be a really tough place to play. Like, a lot of these same conversations we're going to have about Oregon about, hey, tough place to play, top 5 opponent, opponent that's, pretty good. Like, those same conversations are going to pop up. So I think there's 3 games, but I still think it's Michigan because, 1, I think you might play Oregon again. But 2, the narrative of getting out from under that Michigan 3-year stretch, I think, is really big mentally for this team. I think it's big for Ryan Day. I think getting past that Michigan hurdle, which I think they're going to do if you've watched Michigan play football this year, but I think that game still, that is going to be an exclamation point, a jumping board, a leaping off point, however you want to say it, going into what's next for this football team. So I think it's still Michigan because of what has happened these last couple of years. Yeah, the Oregon game's really important. Yeah, I think Oregon's the best team on their schedule. But in terms of most important, I still think it's Michigan. I still think it's the Wolverines.
I don't know if you guys can hear that music in the background that's happening out on the outdoor fields, but it seems like they're testing the speakers because when they have practice this evening on Tuesday, they're going to be piping in some sound to get ready for a primetime matchup in Eugene, which makes a lot of sense. I don't know how important this game is in a world where it doesn't cost you anything anymore, because whoever loses this game is still in a position to make the college football playoff. Right? And so I don't think from the importance of it, from this magnitude of your national championship race, has kind of gone off the table when you went to 12 teams. It's important because these two have been considered the best 2 teams in the Big Ten coming into the year. There's these big picture conversations that we're going to be having on Buckeye Talk, so go find Buckeye Talk wherever you listen to podcasts. All the different things. But when you're just talking about a 60-minute football game, I don't know if some of that importance is still there when you have a 12-team playoff. I agree with you, Andrew. The Michigan game is still the most important because that's all about culture, especially that we know that Michigan's not very good. They've got 2 losses already, still ranked, but they're not very good.
So that's more off the field. That's more an off-the-field importance. I think this might be more on-the-field important just because of how good Oregon is. I think Michigan means more obviously for the fan base and everything, but in terms of, like you said, culture, that's a good point. Just off the field and everything encompassing it, I think that's why it's Michigan.
I don't know if I agree with that either. I think Penn State might be more important when we get to that game, but we'll see, right? We'll see what happens when we get to that game. Hey, Indiana.
Well, but I think this game sets up all those games in November. Like what we're talking about with like Georgia when they lost to Alabama. Now we're looking at, well, now Georgia has to go to Texas. Like if you lose that game, like you're suddenly like dropping on the playoff conversation. Like if they lose to Oregon, then that Penn State game is just like, whoa, like now you're playing for your playoff life. If you win this game, it makes November so much easier for you. So I think this game is important. Like maybe it doesn't maybe knock you out of the playoff, but it's going to make every game in November feel like do or die, as opposed to kind of having a little bit of leeway. And because do you really want to go into the Michigan game? If you're undefeated going into the Michigan game, it's like, all right, beat the crap out of Michigan and you're feeling pretty good about yourself. Or do you want to go into that being like, we just lost this team 3 years in a row and they have nothing to play for, but they can play spoiler, and the entire playoff hopes might rely on that game. Like it changes everything in November if you lose this game. That's why I think it's pretty important.
It's a fair point, but it's the tone setter, and so I think just because it's first through the door doesn't mean it's the most important for me. But I get that. That's a fair point to bring up. I don't know. I'm having a hard time reading this game right now. I'm not sure how this game is going to play out, but we do know that there's a sign back there that says beat O. Ohio State used to do this thing every single week where they would put that up on the big screen out in the indoor field. They stopped doing it consistently last year, and they haven't done it all year. Well, they pulled it out for the Oregon game, so that shows you how much they care about this game, even if Ryan Day is trying to tell us all that it's only a 4.5-hour flight while it's 3.5 hours to get to Nebraska. Though for us, it's going to be a lot more than 4.5 hours because we've got layaways, unlike Ryan Day and the Ohio State football team. Get the text 614-350. We'll continue to talk about this on the pod. We'll go listen to Buckeye Talk wherever you find podcasts. Steven, Andrew, Stefan, bye-bye. Importance.